All right, Rohit, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a while since our last chat, almost 2 years now, I think. So thanks for coming on the show again.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, obviously we catch up and chat every week, but yeah, it's fun to be able to do this again. I can't believe it's been 2 years, but
I know, it's crazy.
A lot's happened.
A lot has happened, so I'm keen to dive into that and learn what you've been up to and what's changed in the past few years. So I guess obviously you've been on the show a few times, so people probably are pretty familiar with your background, but for those who might not have watched that, would love to just get a quick overview of your kind of background and where you came from.
Yeah, it depends how far back you want to go, but obviously we've done a few of these, so I'll give a very brief overview and summary. So ran a previous startup called Stage Label, so we were tagged as a crowdfunding for fashion platform, essentially helped launch and grow about 150 different brands globally over a couple of years. And then ever since then, I've been sort of closely connected into the startup ecosystem, ran a couple of different types of businesses. Most recently, I was part of the AWS startup team, which I left about a year ago, just over a year ago now. And had very specific plans for what I wanted to do after that. But essentially tying a lot of those pieces together was a podcast that I've been hosting for the last 7 years or so. Podcasting is how we first kind of connected as well. So it's definitely been a really sort of integral part of a lot of the glue of things that I've done. And then, off the back of that, launched Playbook Ventures, which we do together, which I'm sure we'll kind of dive into. And then more recently, 1FF, which just came out of stealth, which has been a fun ride to build so far.
Yeah, amazing. And yeah, super keen to dive into that because obviously, as you mentioned, we sort of catch up every week and have conversations. So I've seen the amount of work that's gone into 1FF especially, and then obviously us working together with Playbook Ventures, seeing a lot of stuff that's going on there. So keen to unpack that a bit more and share sort of what we've both been up to in a way. But I guess with 1FF, obviously you just recently came out of stealth, so congrats. You announced your raise led by Blackbird, which is amazing. We're keen to just to begin with, get a bit of a high-level overview of what 1FF is and sort of how that concept came about.
Yeah, so essentially the backstory of how 1FF came about was through an article in the BBC that my co-founder Pete read, which was about how the most interesting football teams and specifically kits were designed around clubs that didn't really exist. And obviously what it meant was that a lot of these people were spinning up e-commerce brands to kind of create very different types of kits, like football and kits by nature of just having stuck in pretty much the same silo for 150 years and are not naturally, for most people, designed for like fashion statements. A lot of it is like I'm a huge Liverpool fan, I'll buy their kit every year. It's not something that I wear day to day, it's just something that I have as a collectible and just something that I like doing. But essentially all of these people were spinning up e-commerce brands to create more interesting and diverse kits that were actually sort of more in line and things that people wanted to wear as sort of fashion statements, whether they were just, going about everyday life or having a kick about on a football field. And essentially that kind of evolved to, that's a really interesting concept, but instead of making up results on things or trying to make up a story around that, like what if there were other teams that kind of competed around this, and then, if teams are competing, then there are players, and what does that look like? And I think sort of things sort of snowballed off the back of each other. So what that's kind of cascaded down to now is that we've built the world's first global digital football league. So we have 12 teams that are located all over the world in traditional footballing markets, like a team in London, a team in Paris, a team in Buenos Aires in Argentina, but also where there's a lot of fandom and engagement in football. So places like Lagos in Nigeria, India, Indonesia, and so on, where they don't really have kind of representation to top tier level competition. And in our league, we operate like any other league. So, teams play against each other, but instead of having real people kicking around a football inside a stadium, we've created 252 CGI generated characters and athletes, each with their own looks and names and attributes and personalities and backstories that with these matches that get played out through this really smart maths engine that takes in a bunch of variables that kind of go into making up a football match. We then convert that into a 8 to 10 minute broadcast that's designed for the way that fans engage with content, especially younger fans. So, you'll find that consumption habits, because of social media and all of those sort of things, are changing. And so we've created a product that's specifically designed for them. So it's shorter, more highlight narrative, storyline driven, that we add professional commentary over the top and stream that out through social media channels and through a bunch of our media partners. But so that's a core product, but where we think that our real value prop sits is changing the way that fans can engage with the sport that they love. And so that's three main ways. So they can follow along with their favorite teams and players and buy kits, as they do with what we call stadium football in our office. The second layer is really kind of honing in on a deeper fan engagement, specifically around our players. So each of the players in our league will have 10,000 player cards that we'll release over time that fans can buy into via packs. Ultimately they'll be able to kind of share in the proceeds of these players that are already starting to get endorsement deals on social media channels and those sorts of things. But in the interim, they get to be involved in like their training and development. And for example, if their contract expires and the team that's based in LA is offering a ton of money, but the team in Japan is an open spot, and so they're more likely to play and develop as an asset, we want the fans to almost act as a player's agent and decide what happens to that specific player's career. And then the third layer is, although our players and our matches are virtual, our teams operate like any other sporting team. So they have the same revenue channels like kit sales and merchandise and corporate sponsorships and those sorts of things. They just don't have match day ticket sales because we don't have physical stadiums for people to go in and watch these matches. But on the flip side, owners of these teams don't have to worry about stadium infrastructure costs and training facilities and medical staff and all those sort of things that are inherently built into operating football teams. And so what we've done is essentially converted each of the teams into its own corporate entity that has 4 main ownership groups. So we retain a small portion of each of the teams. 20% we reserve on behalf of fans that we convert into 100 million club credits for each of these teams that fans will be able to earn through things like watching matches or through performing kind of engagement activities that normal fans kind of operate. They'll also be able to buy those club credits directly over time. We also have a small portion that we reserve for A-list athletes, celebrities, and influencers from each of these markets. So we've announced people like Naomi Osaka, Nick Kyrgios, Steve Smith, Kamaru Usman, Chris Smalling, Patrice Evra, a bunch of just incredible athletes from cross-section of football and a range of other sports who kind of act as the face of those teams. And then we've got a majority stake that will then sort of bring on the right types of corporate partners or not necessarily corporate partners, like people who strategically understand what it's like to operate a bunch of footballing teams. And we're deep into conversation with a number of parties on that front.
Yeah, amazing. It's so cool. And yeah, obviously I've kind of seen the work that's gone into this the past year, kind of building it out, and it's been incredible just to see some of the names you've got on board, as well as supporters for the team ownership as well. And I guess I'd love for you to kind of explain or kind of just give insight into what actually kind of goes into creating this virtual football league, because I think maybe someone on the outside might look in and think, okay, this kind of makes sense. It's like the rise of esports. People are going to live sporting events less and less, but they still want to be engaged and kind of be a part of a team and sort of watch things. And so there's a lot of tailwinds there that kind of make sense. But how do you actually create that virtual football league, and what actually goes into creating that in terms of workload? Because you've sort of been working on this for the past year, so we would love to just give a bit of an insight into that.
In short, a lot of different things. I mean, one thing is, like, I would say that we've been very lucky and grateful to not just have like a great idea, but be able to sort of pull together an incredible team of people. Like, there are specific people in our team. Carl, for example, who's one of our first hires, he's one of a handful of people that would have been able to build the match engine. So he's our chief data scientist. One of the few people that we've been able to build this to the degree and the scale that we have. And to be honest, we had specific ideas of what this might look like, and you kind of bring on the right type of people that just take that and run with it and make it 10 times better than what you even thought that it could be. And which has been very fortunate to have that across, pretty much every area of the business, to be honest. It kind of involves a lot of different things, like with any business. I think we have the amazing opportunity and challenge of trying to do this at scale from day one globally. Like, all of the advice is, kind of focus on one market first and win that, and kind of create the playbook and work out how you're going to do that. We kind of decided to flip the model a little bit, but it's also just kind of really tied into the type of business that we're trying to operate. Like, obviously we're just so bullish and ambitious in terms of what we're trying to build. It's incredible amount of work that goes into it. But I think even just kind of telling the story, there's a lot that I've skipped over in terms of the level of depth and detail that goes into it. So everything from thinking about personality characteristics of players to narrative arcs and those sorts of things that we sort of, put out, that's part of everyday sort of footballing life and culture. How do we embed that into something that we're doing, but where people have ownership stakes of players and teams? We can't just come up with those sort of things. And so we've built this other, narrative engine that kind of spits out the storylines that we then sort of push out and all those sort of things. And that's just like, again, talking about one layer of the business. And so, I would say that it's a tough question to answer.
I guess, because I think even what you said there makes a lot of sense, because, there's all these things that just naturally happen if you have people in the real world, which can engage fans. And obviously there's challenges with that, but there's also things that naturally happen, whereas you're essentially having to manufacture everything that comes from it. So like you said, from the personalities of the players to the kind of matches themselves, like all these things you have to create from scratch and really like use a lot of creativity. Even when it comes to like the broadcast, obviously there's just like a ton of work that comes into like all like, even just producing all the clips and sharing them on all the different platforms. Like there's so much work that goes behind the scenes that I think a lot of people wouldn't see. And, where they might just look at something like this on the surface and be like, okay, cool, it's like some virtual players playing games. Like, just when you actually dive into the complexities, it's pretty incredible what you've done over the past year. So.
Yeah, thank you. And to be honest, I think it's like that for every startup. I think the challenge is always making things look really simple and good for the end consumer, but no one really sees the challenge of putting this together. Like, take this podcast, for example. You've got, I don't know if I'm breaking the third wall, but like you've got 3 cameras and lighting and everything kind of set up, and people would just kind of see the end result of that. But like there's actually a ton of detail and thought that goes into executing something properly and to the level and depth that you want. The challenge is, how do you make people not think about that and just think about hopefully the quality that you're putting out.
Yeah, it's almost like, how do you make it look so effortless? And to do that requires so much effort.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. And you mentioned some big names that you've got on board, like Naomi Osaka, Steve Smith, all these amazing athletes and people. Just curious, like, how did you kind of approach those kind of partnership conversations, and what do you think it is that made them kind of buy into the vision so much for 1FF?
Yeah, great question. I think it's always hard to bring the right type of people on, and especially a lot of the people that we brought on was like very early into the piece before we had anything in place. I would say like we were very fortunate that that we had so many people that really got this from the start when we didn't have anything tangible, that really wanted to push us and kind of open doors towards the right type of opportunity. So, for example, Kamara Usman was the first person that we brought on. We actually connected with him because a friend of mine was involved with bringing Shaquille O'Neal to Australia. And I mean, Shaq was someone that we wanted to speak to, but wasn't the right fit for him in terms of like timing and those sort of things. But his agent looks after Kamaru, and there was a better fit there. And then that kind of led to Kamaru wanting to bring people involved, especially from a Niger United team, which is the team in Lagos. And then we've just had like multiple different kind of threads and conversations and things that have kind of led off the back of each other. I would also say like we've had instances like Nick Kyrgios, for example. We thought in so many ways he's such a perfect fit, and he absolutely is. But we tried 3 different channels and introductions, but it was the 4th one that kind of led to it as well. And so I think a lot of time it can just feel like you're kind of going up against a brick wall, but sometimes it's just finding the right in with those things. I think more broadly, like taking a step back in terms of why I think people were willing to help. I had a chat on my podcast with Nikki Skivak, who ended up leading this round from Blackbird, and he's been fantastic to work with. But one of the things that he and Blackbird really focus on is people doing their life's work, and how it really attracts the right, like doing something really ambitious attracts the right type of people that are there. And I think absolutely there's a lot of people that are just like, what the hell is this? This makes no sense. I don't see how it comes together. And on the flip side, I think there are some people that are just like, oh my God, this is absolutely the future. And I absolutely want to be involved or help or all of those sort of things. And so it's just been fascinating to see how little we had and how much people were sort of, willing to sort of lean in and help and support in just putting us in touch with people that, just kind of helped really move the needle for us.
Yeah, no, so incredible. And I guess on that, as a bit of a segue, because you recently announced your $3 million pre-seed round led by Blackbird, which is amazing. So again, congrats on that. But yeah, I just think it's such a fascinating topic to dive into a bit deeper around like that fundraising process, because obviously a bit later we'll talk about the other side of the table that you're on as well with Playbook Ventures. But for you as a founder raising, obviously it's quite a different landscape in terms of fundraising than it was 18, 24 months ago. I just think a lot of founders be very helpful for a lot of founders if you could kind of share a bit about your thought process of, how did you approach that fundraise? How did you get such a phenomenal VC on board? And would love to just kind of understand your process around that fundraise.
Yeah. So again, maybe I'll kind of take a step back and go how this initially started. So Pete approached me with the idea initially, and to be honest, like that was very, very early stages of, I just started more, it wasn't public yet, but I'd kind of started more formalizing stuff around Playbook Ventures, and I assumed that he wanted to talk about investment. And he kind of pitched the idea. I was like, sounds really interesting. Like, how can I help? He's like, well, actually it's just me at the moment, and I'm looking, and I'm looking for a co-founder to come and join. And I was like, that's very gracious of you, and thank you for thinking of me, but like this is not part of the roadmap and plan. Like I've got this idea of what I want to kind of bring in, and starting another company again was not part of that picture as well, especially because I knew how all-encompassing this whole journey was, and I was always open to starting something, but it really, really had to be the right thing. He's like, yeah, that's fine. Like, let's touch base in a couple of days. And I just remember I just could not stop thinking about it. Like I was waking up at 6 a.m, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how match engine and player dynamics and all of those sort of things would work. And I was just like, this is the first thing that I found that is just so aligned to absolutely everything that I would want to do, that it's at least worth giving it a shot. So like literally a couple of days later, I was like, all right, cool, I'm in, let's do this. But I think it also came from a place of like, for anyone that knows me, like I'm such a huge nerd when it comes to football. Like I'll wake up at stupid hours of the night, I'll spend a crazy amount of time playing fantasy Premier League and all those sort of things, and I've done for a long time. I kind of needed to sense check this with other people to go like, what am I not seeing? And part of early investor conversations was actually just like, not necessarily from a fundraising perspective. Like I wanted someone to go like, this idea is terrible and here's why. But no one really did that. That's not to say like people didn't say no, because absolutely we got no's through the process. But again, like I think that, we'll kind of talk about it from an investing perspective, but like I think a lot of people were really excited by the potential of how big this could be. A lot of the feedback has been like, this is either something that goes to zero and crashes and burns, or is something massive. There's nothing in between, which I think is like the perfect type of venture business to try and build. Especially I think coming from Australia, to build something that global from day one is not as common of an occurrence over here as well. And so yeah, we started some conversations and built some momentum. I would say that it wasn't until you get your lead investor that kind of things really start to move very quickly. We had a couple of other parties that we were speaking to as well. And I think like maybe what's helpful, and I know that not everyone is in the fortunate position to get to choose. But we had some interesting conversations with a couple of really big brand VCs overseas. At the time, Web3 was still a really big thing. And I guess through some of the conversations, there was a lot of excitement over there, but they saw this as a lot more of a Web3 proposition than Pete and I ever did. Like for us, this was always Web 2.5 at best. Like football fans do not care about wallets or ETH or any of those sort of things. They just care about the experience. And so what it kind of meant for us was that, we could have potentially gone down the bigger global brand name path from day one. But like, I think it was more about having the right partner, and Blackbird and Nikki were absolutely the right partners for us. And then, kind of very quickly switched from, once you kind of have a lead investor in place, all of the other conversations that we'd had that were like, yes, but we're just waiting for terms. Things just moved quickly. Again, we were, I guess, in a bit of a fortunate and unfortunate position that like we had a lot of people that were interested and wanted to write bigger checks than we had room available. And so part of the discussion for us was like, do we just take a couple of these people at the amount that they want to come in, or do we bring in everyone? I think like our belief, and especially from Playbook Ventures perspective, is like you just surround yourself with the right type of people, and the more people that have a vested interest in being involved and you have the right type of relationships with, I think the better it is for the company. And so we brought on the right type of strategic investors and a couple of other smaller funds as well, in terms of the fundraise. And like it's I would say like it's absolutely difficult to fundraise, and it wasn't a cut and dry, super easy process for us by any means. But
can you talk about that a bit more? I guess like, what would you say? Because I guess like an external perception of your kind of situation could be, it's like he's had the podcast, he's interviewed all the partners at all these funds, like they're his mates, so he must have just gone and hit them up and got the 3 mil. Like, how would you respond to someone if they sort of had that view, or like what was the reality of your experience?
Yeah, I mean, great question. To my, like, maybe I'm not the best person to answer this, but like from my perspective, I think that the time in building those relationships, like at least earned us an initial conversation and earned us consideration. If I came to them with a shit idea that didn't make sense, there's no way that we would get funded. As we know as well, like we've had people that we've had close relationships with that have come to us for funding, and it's just not the right fit. So I don't think it's a case of just because I was friendly with people or familiar or had relationships with people that it would directly result in funding. But I think it definitely helps from having a place of trust, especially that early on for something when we didn't really have much to show, aside from pitch deck and an early vision of what this could be. And but fundamentally, like you still have to prove that you're the right team, that you've got a big enough idea that kind of fits the mandate of what these funds are trying to achieve, and that you're the right people to kind of win globally. And so I understand and I get it, but I think from anyone who is part of those conversations would know. And like there's plenty of people that I'm very close with that I thought would definitely be in that weren't, and it's nothing personal, it's just not a right fit. So that's a really good insight, because that's the thing. I think it's so easy. Well, I love what you said that, because obviously you've done the podcast for 6 years, you've had previous startups yourself, you've kind of been in the industry, and you're such a familiar face for so long. And it's almost like all that work, like almost a decade of work, the accumulation of all that just got you a foot in the door, and then you still had to like prove yourself from beyond that. And it's just, I think it's just a really good takeaway where it's like, you do all this work and you lay all this groundwork, but nothing's ever kind of given to you. You have to just get up every day and just prove that you can execute and that you can do well. And I just think it's really important for people to kind of understand that. And also, like I was also very conscious of that as well, of like spending the last 7, 8, 10 years in building a lot of these relationships with people to go, so all this time I've tried to like highlight you in your story and all those sort of things. I've never really like asked for anything in return. This is the one time that I'm asking for something, but again, it also needed to be the right thing. Like if I was finally cashing in those chips to at least start a conversation with someone, like I was also fearful of putting something ahead of them that would just like what? Like that's a really dumb idea. And so, yeah, I was also very conscious of it. But like to me, I think that was like, and I've had multiple opportunities to do those sort of things if I've wanted to, either my own ideas or joining other people. But yeah, I think there's something really special and different about 1FF, and it was the first thing that I was like, you know what, it's absolutely worth cashing in those relationships with for the first time in like 7 years to do that.
Yeah, it's incredible. And yeah, obviously just the beginning with where you're at now. But curious, I guess, because obviously, as I mentioned before, you've run a few different startups in the past and your own businesses. Is there any like lessons you took from, I guess, the way you kind of operated in the past that you're now sort of applying to 1FF, like now having sort of that experience of going through that journey a few times? Any lessons from the past that you're really keeping front of mind now?
A lot. You know, and I think actually like the podcast has been really helpful with a lot of those sort of things as well, in terms of just like frameworks or being able to lean on people and those sort of things too. I think the bigger thing has probably been, you know, when I did a stage label, I was in my like early to mid 20s and very naive, and I don't think that I was like prepared emotionally for everything that was involved with it, and had really set myself up in terms of thinking about like how does this succeed long term with it. And yeah, I think, you know, part of being a little bit older and having gone through that experience and kind of understanding that, you know, nothing ever goes to plan, and that you're, you know, like a lot of your job becomes firefighting and putting out problems and stuff. Like I think I'm just in a very different mental state with those sort of things. But also, I think the best thing about running startups is that you kind of learn a lot about yourself through that process. And so I think that, you know, also just kind of smaller things that in the first company I wouldn't have known how to handle, or I would have kind of made particular mistakes. Like the whole idea of going through that is that you learn from them and you hopefully don't sort of repeat those same mistakes again.
Yeah, and in a way, it's like it's almost like that you have more equanimity now, you could say, in a way of like, at the start, because it's crazy. It's like, you know, especially with 1FF, this is, you know, like a 10-year journey, like at least, ideally. And so again, you know, there might have been some things maybe with stage label, some of these early experiences, which really kind of knocked you around a bit. But now I guess like maybe with a bit more age and wisdom, you're sort of looking at those kind of problems in a different way, or realizing, I guess, like having that longer time horizon and just like really, you know, trying to, you know, you want to be your best for this whole journey. And so I guess that also kind of what I'm like super curious around that is, you know, how are you kind of approaching that? Because obviously I've seen, you know, you're doing crazy hours, like schedules nuts, like early starts, like late evenings, all these things. And so, you know, how are you thinking about like, I don't want to say balance, because I don't think if you're a founder you can have like a balanced life necessarily, but how do you think about like operating at a high level for this 10-year journey?
Yeah. Maybe to just go back on one of the things from the previous question is I think the biggest difference for me with 1FF and with Stage Label was that I was fully committed with Stage Label, and I thought that was what I was going to do forever. But there's a very different feeling when you find like genuinely, again, as Blackbird and Nikki put it, when you're working on your life's work. This is everything that I wanted to do when I was like 15, 16. One of my friends from high school actually sent through a document that I think I was in grade 10 or something. We didn't have a school competition, like a football competition at school. And so I created one. And so I created the draw and had convinced all these teachers to be the refs for the matches, and you know, booked out ovals and all of those sort of things, and had this entire thing mapped out. And like, he's like, it's hilarious that that's exactly what you're doing now, just on a bigger scale.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it's, you know, kind of going full circle on a lot of those sort of things. But, you know, as someone who generally is very curious about ideas and likes doing a lot of different things, it is actually very rare for me to find something that I want to do for potentially for like 10 or 20 years. And this is the first thing that I found that I'm like, absolutely, this is it. And so I think the one big difference when it comes to the balance and comes to all of those sort of things is like the inherent amount of knowledge that we have as, you know, essentially we're trying to create this for ourselves as much as anything else. And so I didn't really have that with the last company. We loved the idea of the problem with Stage Label of doing this for fashion designers, but to be honest, we didn't really like know much or care about the fashion industry. We just love the idea of how do you help creatives build successful businesses. And so, yeah, I think it's an entirely different proposition when this is something that you spend all of your free time doing anyway, and getting to do that for work. Yeah, in terms of that balance, like, yeah, it's, I don't know. I feel like I get that question a lot, especially when people look at things from a surface level of, like, you run essentially like 2.5 companies. If you want to count the podcast as a half, like, yeah, you just must have zero balance and all those sort of things. And like, yeah, my schedule is busy with things, but I think that it's not like I'm individually running all of these things, you know. Like, again, we'll get into the Playbook Ventures stuff, but like that wouldn't exist if you weren't there. It was because you kind of like came on and, you know, essentially wanted to run it day to day, that's still kind of operational. With our team, like, we've got an incredible team of people. There's just a bunch of really smart people working super hard at kind of bringing this together. And yeah, there's a lot of work that's kind of involved in the setup, but that's just what you do. And I think it's different when I was talking to someone about this recently, when I don't know if I want to call it out, but like when I was at a previous workplace, working for 8 hours felt like the longest thing ever, because it wasn't the right environment. I wasn't really growing, just was clocking in, and I just didn't have the energy to do anything outside of that. But when you work on something that you're genuinely excited about and have a vested interest in seeing succeed and all of those sort of things, like, it's not like it doesn't feel like work, because absolutely it does feel like work, but it's just a different energy level. Like, you get energy from that. And, you know, I think one of the things that I try and do is, like, time is really important for me, and I want to spend time on the right types of things. I don't want to do it on things that like aren't meaningful or important for me. And, you know, whether that's work, whether that's spending time with friends or family or whatever it is. And so if I'm spending time with something, like, it has to be towards something that I really believe in, something that I really want to see exist. And so, yeah, it's just different when it's something that you believe in so much and want to see exist in the world. So, yeah, not a great answer, and definitely not a balanced balanced framework. But like, I think, you know, you find your own version of balance and what that looks like. Yeah,
for sure. And I think, I mean, the two things I took away from that was, one is that obviously it's important to align your work with what you truly value and what's the message and the kind of thing you want to bring to the world, essentially. Because as you said, like, if you're working on the wrong thing, then 8 hours feels like an eternity. But, you know, when you're working on something that's truly aligned, again, it's definitely hard work and it's still a grind sometimes, but that greater vision allows you to kind of push through. And then I guess the other point was around this idea of, I guess, not trying to do it all yourself, and kind of, you know, building a great team around you and kind of investing in these other people. So curious, like, was that kind of like a mindset shift for you around that, you know, like delegation, or just like trying not to do everything yourself?
I think I still struggle with that at times. And like, there's definitely parts of the process that like would make more sense for me to delegate at the moment. So like, I look after all of our broadcast process, which at least twice a week means I'm sort of on from about 9 a.m. to 1 a.m. Just to be online and kind of manage that process end to end. not something sustainable and long term. And so, part of building something this big is also realizing that like you actually don't know the answers to everything, and you need to bring in the right people who are much smarter, much better at executing different parts of the business. And like that is a natural thing. And I think part of going through that first startup was also a humbling experience of kind of realizing actually there's probably one or two things that you're good at and you're terrible at everything else. So make sure you've got the right people involved as part of that. But I think also the flip of that as well is also realizing that for this to be what we want it to be, obviously we want it to kind of take off very quickly, and the early feedback has been amazing, but like our ambition is what this, will eventually kind of come out in 5, 10, 15 years. And if you kill yourself in that process, that doesn't really help you get there. And you can only do that as a collective group of people, but then also putting in the right systems around the team. So for example, just this week, I had a conversation in the team meeting to say like, hey, I need to find a better balance around how I'm managing my schedule, because I just can't pull like the hours that I'm pulling and not fall over and be totally burnt out. And that goes not just for me, but everyone across the team. Everyone at an early stage startup is so critical that if you have one part of it that's just like off or not performing, like it's just really, really hard. And so even just taking the people side of it as away, because like obviously we care about the people, even just purely from a business context, like it makes no sense to burn people out through that process. And so one other thing that I kind of implemented a little bit earlier this year, which was a bit of a hump for me to get over, was I feel so much better when I like commit to working out. And I was finding it really hard to find time through the day because like hours are crazy. There's always kind of something that's on. And I felt very guilty for taking time out of the day to go work out when the team is here and working really hard and all of those sort of things. But again, I was just like, this is not sustainable, and I can't be at my best if I'm not taking care of myself in some way. So I started booking out my lunch times to do, to like essentially go to the gym. And what I think that kind of actually had the interesting and opposite effect to what I thought it was going to have was, instead of people getting annoyed at me for doing it, everyone's like, oh, cool, like maybe I should go for a walk, or maybe I should do other things as well. Just kind of happened in varying degrees of things. But like, I think that's probably the big thing for me is, doing that from like a expectation and a culture perspective, because like our team works exceptionally hard. But they need to, like, we need them on to do this long term, not for 3 months.
Yes, exactly.
Because you're not going to build the type of company we want to build in that type of time period. And you also just want to retain your best people as well. And you want this to be something that they're fulfilled in, both from a work context, but also gives them the right, like balance of things that they need to be able to sort of continue to grow, both from a work context, but also take care of themselves as well through the process.
Yeah, that's so important, man. And like, I just really believe it. And, like I try to do a similar thing as well, like train most mornings. Because again, I feel like that's the time of day where I just know there's going to be no other external distractions or things to pull me away. And you just notice it, man. If you don't like get that in, it will get that workout. Like, sure, you got more hours in terms of that you're allocating more time to the work, but like your brain's not operating at the highest level. You're making like mistakes. It's just like you don't feel as good. And so I think it's so important. And I think it's also important that you like show your team that that's okay. And you're sort of like setting the example as well, because again, everyone can be in the office like 18 hours a day just grinding, and like everyone can just burn out. But like you said, this is a 10-year journey, not a 3-month journey. So
yeah,
how do you set that?
And I mean, I would also say like that there are very particular things about like our company and our culture that we take very seriously. So a big thing for us has been, probably counter to what most companies think about, especially at the stage that we were at, is like we're in the office pretty much 5 days a week. And that was very intentional from the start because of the speed that we wanted to move at, of the type of like velocity and depth of decisions that we need to make. We just felt like it was so much more effective to do that in person than trying to rally people together over Zoom. And obviously that means that, there are potentially some great people that we that weren't the quite fit for us on both sides, obviously from a hiring perspective. But what it did mean is that, like, again, the type of people that you do attract really believe in that and kind of want to fit into that type of culture as well. And so the balance of that is that we don't dictate that that everyone has to be here between 9 and whenever, Monday to Friday. Like, we hire really senior people and we give them a ton of trust and responsibility, and as long as they're kind of getting things done, we understand people have life things and sometimes people work from home and all of those sort of things. But what we're trying to do is build a culture where the default is that people spend time together and come into the office, because that's just where they do the best work, and obviously kind of creating an environment where people are looking forward to and want to come in versus dreading that as well. And so let's get really thoughtful in terms of the type of space you have, the location of the space, and all of those sort of things as well. But yeah, I think that setting expectations up front is really, really important. And you just want to make sure it's aligned, because if it's not, and you're telling someone from a hiring perspective that, like, oh yeah, you can totally work remote all the time, and it doesn't make sense, but that's not the type of company you're trying to build, it just won't work.
Yeah, 100%, man. Yeah, I do tend to agree with you that just especially at the early stage, it's just like, it's just so much better to have everyone just in the same place, like feed off each other's energy. Like, it's hard to kind of bring that 18-hour like a day passion or whatever to if you're sitting in your spare room at home sometimes, or isolated from everyone else. So
yeah, and I would also say, like, where that was very much the first 10 or 12 people, was like everyone was here. We've since expanded out that we're like well above 20 people now, and that does mean we have people around the world and people in the UK and in Asia and South America and things like that. And so you have to get better, and like, this is not a forever thing, but I think for, again, being very intentional with like what we needed at a very specific point in time, knowing that things will evolve and change, it doesn't need to be a forever decision, but at that particular moment in time, for what we needed, like, that was the focus and approach. And yeah, that's again, just kind of setting that expectation up front.
Yeah, cool, man. Awesome, man. Yeah, I want to kind of talk about some of the other things you're working on, but I guess just on 1FF, I guess what's like the ultimate vision, or like what's sort of like coming up, how you've obviously, I think you said you've got about 22 employees now, so obviously growing like super fast. So yeah, what's the kind of immediate next steps, or what are you kind of focusing on most at the moment?
I mean, immediate next steps is like, we're in the middle of the season right now, so yeah, we're a couple of rounds into season 1. It's like there's so much more that's kind of coming, and kind of depth and roadmap wise in terms of product and everything that we're trying to do. I mean, ultimately our vision is there are eight global leagues that generate over $1 billion in revenue each year. We want to be number 9 and climb that list. We very much see ourselves as a football league first and foremost. We're not trying to be the next Football Manager or FIFA, the game, or PES or anything. We have a very clear vision of what we're trying to build. What's fun about the type of model and way that we're building that is the types of opportunities that kind of creates off the back end of that. But first and foremost, that's kind of our North Star. Feels a little bit ridiculous to say that we will, at this stage, that we'll kind of take on La Liga and the Premier League and those sorts of things as in terms of like fandom and being seen on par with that. But yeah, that's definitely the longer term aim. And yeah, in the short term, there is a ton of work that we are doing at the moment, and a ton of things that we've got sort of, like I said, on the roadmap that will kind of improve the fan experience and just really change the ways that what we think for the better is like the fan experience around sport that has been such a traditional one-way interaction pretty much through history. So yeah, super excited to see where it ends up.
Awesome. Yeah, super keen to follow the journey. Again, I've had a bit of a inside look into what you've been doing the past year, and it's awesome to see everything that's come so far. And really just the beginning. So congrats again on that. And I'd love to kind of shift gears a bit and talk about your other baby as well that you're working on at the moment with Playbook Ventures. So so obviously with Playbook Ventures, investing in super early stage startups. So we'd love to maybe start with like the story of, I guess, how did you start investing in startups, and how's that kind of evolved over time into what is now Playbook Ventures?
Yeah, I mean, the backstory about like the culmination of that coming together is, I think the podcast was a really big kickstart as part of that process. So when I first started the Startup Playbook podcast about 7 years ago, I just had a lot of founders that would reach out for help, support, guidance, connections. A lot of them were fundraising. So I played the ad hoc sort of matchmaker role between them and VCs and angels. A couple of those companies ended up doing quite well. I was like, crap, I should probably have put some money into this. Not that I had much money to invest at the time. And so I sort of was quietly angel investing for the last few years and was intentionally trying not to make that too public because it's with the podcast and stuff, like your inbox gets a little bit crazy. And I definitely wasn't trying to do that as a full-time thing. But yeah, after, making that sort of transition a year ago, the plan was to go full-time on the podcast and launch this angel syndicate initially sort of starting off with friends and guests of the podcast. So just successful, experienced operators, a lot of whom I would go to when I was looking at deals or kind of investing in things to say, hey, is this something that you'd be sort of interested in and looking at for yourself as well, is to create a bit more of a structure around that. And then, I guess like we've sort of slowly started building that and expanding that base of investors out. So we've got about 50 plus people who are individual investors that are kind of signed up. We've completed 6 deals to date. I think that, for me personally, it's such an interesting perspective having being on both sides of the table. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't think, obviously if it isn't already obvious, James and I do Playbook Ventures together. I think what I think has been really interesting from my perspective has been, we're kind of the in-between between like a fund and on the founder, like just being friends with the founders. And so oftentimes a lot of founders will kind of come to us when they're thinking about raising the next round or kind of, pulling together the right people on the cap table and all of those sort of things. And so, I think we just play this really interesting role for the companies especially for the companies that we invest in, of just being that conduit between them and investors, where they don't have to worry about us taking board seats and all of those sort of things, but just really being on their side to like help them work through and navigate a lot of those relationships.
Yeah, it's been a phenomenal journey so far. Obviously, as Rohit mentioned, coming on board and helping grow that out over the past year has been amazing. I guess we'd love to kind of understand, from your perspective, obviously there's a lot of opportunities to invest in a lot of different founders and companies and industries. So what do you kind of look for in an opportunity, both on like the actual opportunity itself and also just like founders in general? Like, what do you kind of look for when you invest?
Yeah. Also, I noticed that you breezed over this. So like, let me just double down on this a little bit, which is, as I mentioned earlier, like, I don't think Playbook Ventures would be existing right now if it wasn't for you jumping on and doing that. So obviously when 1FF was starting to take off, I couldn't devote the same energy and focus that we kind of needed. And you and I used to go on like weekly walks that we started during lockdown and just kept going for a long time. And you were going through an acquisition through Northbound, and we were having these conversations about like what's next for you and the type of roles and things like that you would do. And like, as I think life has a tendency to kind of work out, just things just aligned. And, from my perspective, I think I've said this to you before, but like, if you had said no, there was no like backup option. I didn't want to do it with anyone else. I'm grateful that you said yes. And it's been like an amazing journey to kind of do that with you for the last just over a year or so.
Sure.
I think that, and I think that even you kind of coming on is like doubling down on where we think the real sort of focus for us is obviously we've got a large part of our investor base that are founders and operators themselves, but I think it just comes like a different level of understanding and empathy of not just being a former founder, but very recently being founders that have gone through that journey. So, for you literally going through an acquisition, for me building a company concurrently while we're investing in companies as well. Like, I think we just have a different lens and perspective on things because we've done it so recently and we're doing it live on things that I think it just gives us a different type of like perspective and value add for the companies that we both speak with and look at and ultimately invest in.
Yeah, I tend to agree, man. And again, have many conversations with founders, and a lot of them say that specifically, that they're so happy to hear that, both you and I are very recent founders, or current for yourself. And so I think you're right. It does just bring not only from the investment standpoint of like being able to kind of know like what should this look like, or is this a bit weird that they're set up this way or whatever, but yeah, just I guess even just like having that empathy and understanding the journey to an extent. I think that can't be under kind of stated how valuable that can be. Sometimes I think at times, sometimes even just being able to speak to a founder, like founder to founder, and just be like, hey, this is like fucked, like what should we do or whatever, and just actually being able to have some empathy and not just like be like, like think about XYZ like hypothetical thing. It's like, yeah, when I ran my company, like this thing fucked up and like our revenue dropped by 80% this month or whatever, and just being able to kind of share those war stories to an extent, I think is it does give, it's valuable for sure. So.
Yeah, and like I think from the other side of like assessing deals as well, like I think it's definitely been an important marker, I think, for both of us as well, of understanding what it takes to build companies as well and what's required, and just kind of making sure that that's aligned with the founders and teams that they're building and all of those sort of things as well. Like I think I just think it's not a natural and normal process, I think, for most investors, but like I think it's just been, and it definitely wasn't deliberate, but like I think that it's been a kind of fascinating thing of the I guess like the different perspective that we can have or different value that we can add as kind of having concurrently or kind of very recently gone through that journey too. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, it's amazing, man. And I guess as well, we'd love to, because you mentioned that we've done 6 investments this past year, which is great. All amazing companies and amazing founders that we really believe in. Could you just give like an example of like maybe 1 or 2 of the companies that we've invested in that have kind of publicly announced their raise, just so I guess to give the people listening a bit of a understanding of the kind of opportunities we look at and the kind of things that we invest in, and also potential investors that might be listening?
Yeah, and I also realized that I didn't answer the question initially.
Circle back to that.
That you phrased around, what is it that we sort of look for? So again, like maybe to take a step back and answer that question first, we are sort of primarily pre-seed investors. We like coming in at the very first round. We've done, so like 4 of the deals so far have been pre-seed and 2 have been seed stage. We don't invest any later than that. And I think more and more we're having a more dedicated focus on pre-seed, primarily because both in terms of the value that we can add, but also just because of the networks. And when we see deals, like a lot of it just tends to be very, very early. And, I think a big part of our thesis is that, or the way that I've always kind of thought about investing is that, a lot of the risk profile for startups doesn't actually change for a very long time until like Series B and beyond. But obviously the valuation changes quite significantly. And if you're an angel investor and writing small checks, you at its most basic level, you want to come in when the price is at the lowest to give you the maximum upside. But obviously you've got to kind of balance the risk that comes with having less data and less information. And the way that we balance those things out is we, invest alongside institutional funds. So we don't lead deals. We'll either sort of come in on the back of, a lot of the deals that we've done have been oversubscribed, and so they'll want to bring us on as strategic investors to sit alongside the other funds that are there. And sometimes we'll be the first investor, and a big part of our role is to use our relationships and networks that we have to help bring in the lead and help bring in the right investors around the cap table, so the founders are spending less time fundraising and more time building their company, which is what they and you want them to be doing. And so yeah, that's kind of like high level in terms of how we think about investing. We're very industry agnostic. I think it's just in terms of things that we look for. Like I'm not going to say anything out of the ordinary, to be honest. Like a lot of it is at the early stages when you don't have a lot of data. We're investing in things pre-revenue, sometimes even pre-product. So much of it is off the back of founders, because your level of trust in them is whatever you're pitching is probably going to change in 3 months, definitely going to change in 6 months, absolutely going to change in 12 months. And so what you're taking a bet on is that these founders are the right type of founders to figure it out. And so we put a large amount of emphasis on them. I know that that's a very generic answer. I guess one of the things that we really hone in on and look for is what we call like an unreasonable amount of progress. Like what's something special and different that they've achieved very early on with very limited time and like probably product in place. And that can look like everything from attracting like really high caliber team members. That can be having POCs with incredible pilot customers. That can be a range of different things, but I think we just place a large emphasis on like not just what does the founder say that they're going to do, but what are they actually doing right now. And in between meetings, like maybe to give away some of the things for founders that we're speaking to at the moment is, in between meetings when we check in with them, like what's the progress that they've made through conversations that we've had. Like the biggest advantage for a startup is definitely not capital, but it is the ability to make quick decisions and move at speed. And if they're not taking making full utilization of that advantage, it's really just doing a disservice. And so, yeah, I would say like at the start, so much of it is built off the back of the founders and their just ability to demonstrate that they can build some momentum around them from scratch. And I think the second part of it is, for the risk that you're taking from an angel investment perspective, you want the payoff to be big enough to be worth that risk, because like no one really speaks about it enough, but chances are that a lot of those investments that you make don't pan out the way that you want them to. But with the power law, which essentially says that one or two of the deals will kind of make up the losses for all of the investments that you've made so far and give you a multiple times return on that. Like you're just hoping that you've got the right type of investments that you're making in as part of your portfolio. And so that's what we look at is, are these the right type of founders to succeed with what they're trying to do? And do we believe enough in them that they're the right people to attract the right type of talent and customers and investment, all those sort of things, and can we lean in and support and help them do that? And the second part is, if they do win, like, is that market opportunity big enough for it to be a meaningful victory, for it to be a meaningful bet for us to place? And there's like a ton of like smaller things, but like I would say fundamentally, those are the kind of high level points that we look at.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, again, if you really boil it down, it really just does come down to, at that early stage where there's not a lot of data points, is this founder unreasonable in a good way? Are they executing? Have they been able to pull together a great team? Do you believe that they can execute on this vision? And then is the market opportunity big enough for this to make sense from a financial point of view? And those 2 points are kind of the only things you really have to go off at that early stage. So
yeah. And, in terms of like specific companies that we've invested in, like one that recently announced their raise is a company called Kismet, which is led by a founder named Mark Woodland. He was previously the founder of a company called Explore Education that had a successful exit about 2.5 years ago. He's then taking the same core executive team, same relationships, going after a much bigger opportunity where initially they were focusing on childcare to now in the NDIS, and then ultimately with aged care. It's just a huge market opportunity and incredible operating team on that. We were the only angel network that was part of that deal. So very fortunate to kind of be involved. We just, got in on that relationship through just some close personal relationships that we have. And on that, I'm very fortunate to be backing behind that company. And again, like that's a perfect example of just great operators that, like Mark and his team are just exceptional operators. I'd say there's another one that I was going to name, but I'm not going to name them specifically, but maybe kind of talk about, I had a conversation with the founder about a week ago who's going through a very difficult personal challenge at the moment that I think will kind of come out in its own time. That, it's probably not the right place for me to kind of talk about and name publicly, but, even just talking to him about a really difficult personal situation. And fundamentally, I think the company's doing great and all those sort of things, but that stuff aside, for him to go through such a difficult personal thing and just remain so like optimistic and just I think it's through really difficult times that you see people's true character. Yes. And I think that definitely shone through. And I remember speaking to you about it, and again, outside of like that whole experience, I remember both of us just saying, yeah, like we had no question when we backed him, and like it's even now, like even more now in terms of his kind of character and personality and things like that. So I'm not going to name the company, but like, I think that, like I said, like a big focus and emphasis for us is on backing the people behind the company. And as Gary Vaynerchuk puts it, like backing the jockey?
Backing the horse or the jockey. I don't know which one.
One of the two. Maybe we'll cut out this bit, but yeah.
Nah, it's so true, man. And yeah, it's incredible. And that situation that you're talking about, like, again, like you said, because it's easy in times of good to kind of, be a certain way. But then again, when times are tough and, shit's hit the fan, that's when like people's true character tends to come out. And then so, like I like to think of myself as like, if times are good or times are bad, I'm kind of the same person. And I know you are as well. And those are the kinds of people we want to surround ourselves with as well. And so, even just to see that is incredible. And obviously we're doing everything we can to support that founder in that regard.
Yeah, and I think that it's often something that's overlooked from the outside, right? And I remember thinking this with Stage Label too. I was like, I am absolutely the worst founder, because everything that you hear about other companies, it's going amazingly well and they're kicking all of these goals and all of those sort of things. I think one of my biggest lessons over the last like 8 or 9 years of doing this has been actually everyone is struggling, and it's really, really, really hard even for the best companies for a very, very long time. And again, like I think fundamentally, part of this is that in a very high stress, high stakes environment, like I think people's true character comes out with things. And that's why for us the founders are such a critical part of that, is like them just not just kind of attracting the right types of things, but fundamentally are they, not everyone is really kind of cut out for this in the best way. Like I think that not everyone should start a company, because it's honestly not as great as a lot of people make it out to be. But we just want to really make sure that we're getting behind the right type of founders, and as you said, giving them the right support and things. But fundamentally, like they're the ones that are choosing to turn up in the arena every day. And you just want to make sure that you're that you're just kind of backing the right people. Yeah,
absolutely. And kind of segues into another topic I was curious to get your thoughts on, because like it sounds like from talking now and obviously knowing you, I feel like so much of the way you think about things and frameworks comes from like this idea of like building relationships and like giving to people without expectation of return, and kind of building these long-term relationships that over the span of like years and decades potentially. And so I guess like, yeah, how do you kind of think about, and you even mentioned before, like that Kismet investment that we made, a lot of that came about through relationships that you had established. And so, how important is relationship building? I guess like in terms of like investing or like as a founder, and, how do you kind of think about that and approach that in your own career and life?
I mean, I think it is really, really, really important. I think it's so hard to manufacture, and I think that's where a lot of people get stuck with it. To be honest, I don't have great advice because like I think I've been very lucky in spending a large amount of time in being in a position where I wasn't asking people for things. I think it's really tough to build relationships when all of your interactions are trying to extract something from someone. And to me, like that is a big part of the reason why I started the podcast as well, was like, how do I get an excuse to just sit down with really smart people and pick their brain for an hour, but like make it so that it's not just them doing me a huge favor, but hopefully that it's helping them in some way as well. It's a similar reason why I joined Startup Vic and turned down this other offer that would have paid me more than double to do that was, at the end of my first startup, I realized I had no relationships and no networks whatsoever. And I was like, I will take a pay cut and spend a year stacking chairs at events and bring out pizza for everyone, because what it would just mean is that for a year, instead of asking people for things, I would be in a position to help other people. And I think that's how you build stronger relationships. To be honest, like I think that it's gotten a little bit harder over time, where like as my calendar has gotten busier and busier, I found that I've become like a bit more reclusive in a way, especially with 1FF in stealth. Like so much focus and time is just focused on that. Like I just don't have the same level of time that I did before to reach out to people or to do things in the same way. And again, we've kind of spoken about this sort of stuff as well. Like I think it's hard when a lot of the interactions that you have with people are them trying to get something from you. And so like I recognize that it's really, really hard. Where I would say try to focus on is like how do you kind of create a two-way relationship with people? And it is hard if you're trying to do that with investors necessarily, because there is a weird power dynamic that's there, and fundamentally you're kind of like you are there ultimately to ask for money to do those sort of things. I would just say try and start conversations with people much early in the piece, try and get them at events or do different things like reach out to them on social media or something, versus kind of expecting the very first interaction that you have with them to lead to a successful pitch. Not to say that it can't happen, but I just think that it's fundamentally so important. And I would say for me, the biggest benefit that's come from the podcast and the relationships has been, it just meant that we could hire people for 1FF. Mm-hmm. Because I'd spent a bunch of time in trying to build like community or like awareness or whatever at scale with it. It just meant while we were in stealth, while I couldn't really talk about the company, could at least like talk about like, hey, I'm doing something. Very high level, here's what we're kind of working on. Would love to chat to anyone who's kind of interested. And I think that's been the most important part of that piece for me. And like I said, on the investment side, it just meant it at least earned us an opportunity to have a conversation with people.
Yeah, so critical, man. And it always comes back to this idea of like planting seeds is how I think about it. It's like, how do you do things just like on a consistent basis, which there's no reward like now, or even tomorrow or even next year. But it's like, if you just keep planting these seeds every single day for years, eventually that compounding effect is going to be so large that there's just going to be so much more opportunity that you don't even know what to do with it.
Yeah.
And I think it's like, it sounds easy in theory, but to actually implement that every day, I think as humans, like sometimes we just look for that immediate gratification, or it's like, can this person help me tomorrow or today? you're not thinking 10 years into the future. And again, it's not to make it sound all transactional in terms of like, how can they help me? And I only want to speak to them if they can, but it's that idea of just like planting seeds and just doing that every day, and then just letting the magic of compounding work.
Yeah, and I think like a big part of that planting seeds is like, you can't have that first interaction, like you said, be a sales pitch. And so I think one of the things that's been really helpful is like the podcast is one way to do that. One thing that I used to do at my agency that, like, funnily enough, we're replicating now with Playbook Ventures is we used to do this thing called Playbook People Breakfast. So we would, like, I'd throw a breakfast and just invite interesting people in my network with no agenda. Like, there was no speaker, there wasn't anything. It was just like, I just wanted to bring together a bunch of interesting people in my network together. And that kind of helped, like, form a bunch of relationships or potential clients that we were speaking to or wanted to speak to. It's just a very, like, informal way to have a initial meeting, and just show and demonstrate that you, like, know what you're doing in some subtle way. And so, you know, we've started doing that with Playbook Ventures as well. We'll kind of throw these dinners every couple of months, every quarter, where we'll just bring together a bunch of founders from our portfolio and some investors from our network and those sort of things. Again, not that there's any sales pitch or agenda at all. It's just bringing together a room of great people. And what you'll often find is that a lot of that, like, leads to follow-up conversations and those sort of things too. Yeah, and so, like, I would say, for like what I was mentioning earlier about, like, me being more inclusive and, like, not really going to events and things like that anymore or making as much of an effort, the way that I've kind of tried to systemize that a bit more is, like, how do I do things that are a little bit more at scale, where instead of me organizing 20 different meetings with people, how do I throw an event where I'm, like, handpicking 20 people to come along, where I can have 20 mini meetings with people without an agenda, but it's like an initial kind of reference point. If it leads to something, then great. If not, like, there's no expectation going into it.
Yeah, super smart. And they're definitely high leverage things to do. So yeah, it's just again, just building those relationships and giving without expectation of return. And the funny thing is, something good will come out of that eventually. And if it doesn't, then that's fine as well. But you probably won't lose in the long run.
No, and it's hard to keep doing it over an extended period of time when, like, you're not really seeing results, like it is with a podcast, like it is with anything. But, like, I'm a big believer, and I think we might have spoken about this in one of the previous podcasts, is like fundamentally, if your thesis is right over a long enough time horizon, it just works. Like, there's no way that it doesn't. So if you throw dinners or if you reach out to 5 people a week for coffee, there's no way that, like, the net output of that is negative.
Yes.
Right? Like, even if it takes a year of doing that to lead to, like, one conversation that changes things, it still led to one conversation that changed things. I think it's just tough to go, because I did this input once, it has to result in an output. And again, I think I might have mentioned this on your podcast, but, like, I'm, like, such a big believer on inputs. Like, you can't control outputs at all, and so, like, it's almost not even worth tracking that or or having that as a reference. Like, it's thinking about, like, same for us, like, you know, we don't have from a dinner it leads to X, we just do dinners. Like, we have you know, we bring together a certain group of people and all of those sort of things. And, like, if you do enough repetitions of those sort of things, like, there's no way that it doesn't work if the thesis is right.
Yeah, 100%, man. Yeah, those inputs and outputs, and focusing on the process as opposed to the outcome. But curious as well, because again, as I mentioned before, you have a very unique insight with your current situation of being on kind of both sides of the table at the same time as a founder and also as an investor. Yeah, just wondering, do you have any, like, advice for founders in general, like, in this current market, if they're fundraising or they're thinking about fundraising? You know, what are the kind of things they should be thinking about, or how should they be approaching fundraising in this environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like, I would say, like, you know, I think there's obviously a lot of negative noise that's out there at the moment about things that have changed, and, you know, things definitely have changed from a fundraising perspective compared to what it was like 18 months ago. But I would also say that there has never been more dry powder in like the Australian venture capital landscape. And so there is absolutely still an appetite to invest. It's just probably the bar has shifted a little bit, and there's less deals that are being done. But like we're definitely like very, very actively looking for things to invest in. Like it hasn't slowed us down, and like I know that's the case with pretty much every single other fund as well. Like everyone is still looking for deals. So I totally understand the pessimism around it. I would just be really thinking through like alignment with the types of investors that you're speaking to as well. Like doing the work ahead of time of, you know, does the investor invest at that type of stage or that type of industry? Are they kind of open or actively kind of investing in things? Have they invested in something that's a direct competitor, which means that like even if they really like you, then they're probably not going to they're definitely not going to kind of invest in your kind of company. So it's just doing that work ahead of time. And then it's like, I know it's hard and it's easier said than done, but like it is a sales process and you're not going to be a right fit for everyone. As despite how incredible you think your company is, there'll be some people that get it and there'll be some people that don't. And, you know, I would just say like, don't let a no discourage you. Like just because you get a no, it doesn't mean that, your company isn't great or it doesn't have potential. And it doesn't mean that like, you're not a great founder. It just means for that particular fund, it's just not the right fit. But I would think about it from a sales process, and I would think about it from like, if you're thinking about it as a sales process, you just want to fill the top of funnel with as many relevant conversations as possible and keep that warm. And as much as it kind of sucks to say this, like a lot of it is built around FOMO. So, you know, as I mentioned earlier, if you get a term sheet, absolutely, you know, use that to your leverage and kind of let everyone know, because as sad as it is, like people will be much more likely to kind of jump and push urgency behind something when they feel like there's momentum around it. And so think a little bit about like the story that you're telling around those sort of things, and strategically how you're mapping those sort of things out as well. Like that's unfortunate. It's an unfortunate part of the story, but like it is a part of the story.
Yeah, I think as well, like you could say it's unfortunate, but again, I think it's just cognizant. I mean, again, like my background, I've done a lot of sales roles in the past, and the way I think about sales is just like, how do you communicate things in terms of other people's values? And so what's like important to them, which is really going to make them pay attention to what you're doing, and how do you kind of like convey your story with that in mind? And so again, you know, when you have investors, especially like a big VC fund, you know, they're getting hundreds of founders approaching them on a consistent basis. Like it's very hard to cut through the noise. And so the way you kind of approach that as a founder is very much like, how do you kind of tailor your messaging so that it really resonates with what they care about and what they're interested in. And it's definitely going to help. So
yeah, no, absolutely. Like you said, kind of tailoring the message. It is a story. And like, you know, part of backing those founders is you need to be compelling enough, not just to convince investors, but you need to convince early employees when, you know, they often have, if they're great, they have multiple different job options on the table. If they want to, they're probably already in a very cushy job and getting paid really well, and they will likely have to take a salary cut to come and join you. So like, why? Why should they do that? You know, why should a company take a risk on you as an early product and all those sort of things? And yeah, it's like you said, it's unfortunate, but it is also a big part of the piece of the puzzle is the founders need to be able to sell themselves to everyone. And yeah, that will go a long way in kind of determining the success of that. And, you know, again, like we're more than happy to help provide feedback and things like that. Even for companies that we don't invest in, we try and provide as much feedback as possible. So yeah, for any founders that are listening that want to talk about those sort of things and figure out how we can help, we're more than happy to have those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Always happy to. So I guess what's next for Playbook Ventures? How are you kind of looking at the next steps for that, or what's sort of coming up in the next year or so for Playbook Ventures?
I mean, like, I think we've got some pretty big plans of what we sort of want to do, but, I think, like, this is probably the first time we've been operating for a year. It's probably the first time that we've properly spoken about what we're doing. I think a big part of the focus for us has been we just want to demonstrate results and use that to kind of speak about what we're doing versus just talk about again hypothetically what we would do. That's the philosophy that I took with the podcast. Was I wanted to bring on guests that could talk about here's what I did and here's the lessons and things like that from that, not hypothetically here's what I would do in those kind of situations in the future. And that's just how I like operating, and that's how we sort of operate. And so we've just been have built an incredible portfolio so far and sort of continue to do that. We're currently operating at a deal-by-deal syndicate structure. I don't know how specifically we kind of want to talk about things, but, we have been looking at launching a rolling fund in the not-too-distant future, and are kind of speaking to quite a few investors at the moment in terms of putting that up. The idea will be that, investors will have an opportunity to sort of pre-commit a certain amount of capital that they feel comfortable with, that will then get split equally across the next 10 deals, so they get exposure across the next 10 investments that we make from a portfolio perspective. So I would say watch the space with a lot of the different things that are coming up, and just more announcements from companies that we're investing in. But also if you're a founder looking for capital, or if you're an angel investor that is looking for kind of access to more deal flow and wants to kind of invest alongside us, whether that's through a syndicate or a rolling fund structure, we'd love to chat. Please reach out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's phenomenal. It's really exciting. I think, as you mentioned, I think a lot of this past year has been going back to that idea of planting seeds, and just, we've been going through the process, doing the reps, building out our portfolio, and, oftentimes operating kind of in silence. And so I think now we've kind of done a lot behind the scenes, and so I think it's time to start being more public facing about what we're doing, and just really like take things to the next level. And it's all these things just compound over time as well. I feel like it's always a grind at the start, but then you get to that point of momentum where things kind of tick along and start humming. And so I feel like I'm very excited for the coming year and beyond. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, so great to see your podcast coming back as well. I know that we've had a few conversations about this and stuff as well. I think this will be the first episode that comes out.
Yes.
So maybe a question to you, James. What took so long? And I guess like what are you sort of envisioning, and what are your plans with the show?
Yeah, great question. So for the first part, why did it take so long? I think it's one of those things that, we've had many conversations about this in private, but I think when I first started the podcast, similar to what you said, I wanted an excuse to talk to interesting people and learn from them directly. And that's how it sort of came about. And, so many great things came off the back of that. Like that's how we connected originally, and just a bunch of other stuff that you can't ever predict, like even like investors in our network sort of came off the back of the podcast and all these things. So, a lot of people who are in my life today who I consider friends as well as business acquaintances came off the back of the podcast. So it's always been a very powerful tool. I think, I never really had the intention, or I never said I'm stopping the podcast. It's just one of those things where, you get busy. I was running Northbound at the time, doing all these things. And so it's just something has to give at some point. And I kind of started publishing less frequently. And then, it kind of got to this point where I felt like, I was like, I haven't published in a while. I should find someone to interview, as opposed to, well, I really want to like interview this person. Like I can't even sleep kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so, I feel like similar to what we were talking about before around like, this is a 10-year journey. How do you kind of make sure you're still doing this in 10 years time? I remember that was something specifically that you said as well around, if you have to take some time off to refresh and come back and make it a 10-year journey, then it's worth doing.
Yeah.
So I feel like I took that to heart, and I always had the intention that I would bring it back at some point. But as you know from doing a podcast, there's a lot of work that goes into it, and it's a very kind of time-consuming thing and energy-intensive. So just never really felt like the right time up until recently. And what you said as well is like, you know, come back when you feel like it's a good time and not before then, because otherwise you'll just do a few episodes and then fall off the wagon again. And yeah, just feel like now seems like the perfect time because, you know, again, coming from like seed planting for the past year, like there's just so many incredible people that we interact with on a day-to-day basis, doing amazing things that I'm genuinely curious about. And yeah, I just like have that feeling of like I want to speak to these people again and leverage the podcast to help them if possible as well. And so yeah, just timing felt right. A lot of people that I'm just interested in talking to, and so that's why we're back now. I think you know, in terms of the vision for what the podcast is, you know, it's funny, like I don't think of it as, I don't want to be like the next like Joe Rogan necessarily, like that's not really how I think about it. I just think of it as, you know, the podcast is a tool at the end of the day. It's a tool to have great conversations with amazing people. It's a tool to strengthen and deepen relationships with people I already know. It's a tool to help, like in the example of our founders, like can we leverage that to really act as a megaphone to what they're building. And yeah, it's just like there's so many benefits that come from it. And so I guess when it comes to the vision, you know, it's a tool that helps me and helps a lot of other people. And so I just want to utilize it.
Yeah. I think it's, and we're just going way off script, but like it's so interesting in the journey that you kind of go through with a podcast or just with all of this stuff is I think there's just different layers and stages and they require different things. So when you're starting, like you need that initial motivation and push to get it to the start line. Otherwise, like why would you go through all of that? Then the motivation runs out and you just need that persistence to keep pushing past that initial stage when it's initially kind of got off the ground to continue doing it for long enough. Then you get to a particular point where I think it's changed so much that it becomes a process of consistency versus a process of growth for you. And like I think like I experienced that, and it sounded like you kind of experienced that as well from the podcast. And then I think it's powerful to like actually stop and take a break and be like, I've proven the first three parts of it, but like now I want to kind of like level up and elevate it. And I think like we've had multiple conversations about bringing the podcast back and stuff like that over the last 2 years. You know, I've felt that fire from you again the last couple of weeks. And on a personal level, I'm just so happy and excited for you that you get to feel that and do that again with the podcast. So mate, stoked to be here and like stoked that you're bringing this back as well.
Awesome, man. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And yeah, I've always appreciated your support and conversations as well. So many more Monday night chats to come, I'm sure.
For sure.
But yeah, I think it's probably a nice place to kind of start wrapping things here, Rohit. Obviously great to dive into your journey with 1FF and Playbook Ventures and podcasting as well. So yeah, I guess just a few like quick rapid fire questions to close out. Have you got I've probably asked this question to you before, so I'll ask it in a different way. Have you got either a favorite book or resource that you've read recently that's kind of really helped you or given you a lot of insight or helped you in today's life?
So I read Atomic Habits a little while ago. I think it was the first book that explained a lot of like the weird quirks and things that I did for a very long time. So like I just felt very understood after reading that book and have gifted that a lot. I think on top of that, I'm obsessed with a guy named David Goggins. I just think his story of how he's recreated himself from the ground up and that sort of things is just such a powerful message to anyone. I think he takes it to a very extreme level, but like I'm such a big believer in like the power of your mind and, you know, like working hard towards things and having a clear sort of vision and just consistency in work. And so he's got a book called Can't Hurt Me, and I think he's got a follow-up that I haven't read yet, but those are probably the two that come to mind. Yeah,
nice. Cool, man. And yeah, I guess what's coming up next for you? Obviously, I guess Playbook Ventures and 1FF for your main sort of projects. Is there anything else you want to add around that, or anything else outside of that that's coming up?
No, I mean, like, I would say if you're a football fan or just curious at all, we'd love for you to check out 1FF. If you're a founder that's looking to fundraise or an angel that's kind of looking to kind of invest alongside some great people, we'd love to chat. And then, I'm also toying with bringing the podcast back as well. So like, watch the space.
Yeah, what took you so long?
We'll see what happens. I mean, similar sort of thing, right? Like what you kind of felt with Northbound, I felt like that with 1FF. Is just that has to be primary focus with things, and again, like just being in a place potentially where like, you know, it's a little bit more kind of balanced and makes sense to bring it back. I'll bring it back, but it just has to make sense. But yeah, priorities and choices.
That's it. Awesome, man. Last point, just what's the best way for people to connect with you? Are you still a recluse, or do you have some space?
I mean, I'm still a bit of a recluse, but yeah, you can definitely, like, I think LinkedIn's probably the easiest. So yeah, I'm not sure if you've got like show notes or something, but yeah, I'm pretty easily findable on LinkedIn. So come hit me up there.
Cool, man. Well, thank you so much for being a guest again, for the relaunched version of the podcast. Again, really appreciate your friendship and your business partnership and everything in between. So thanks for coming on this show, and thanks for being in my life as well.
Yeah, likewise, mate. And congrats on bringing the podcast back. Very excited for you.